Greetings to the students and staff of Eastern Illinois University. My name is James SoSoon Gant. I'm a hip-hop artist with over 20 years of experience as a writer, recorder, and performer, and over a decade in experience as a teacher. Today I'm going to give you a very condensed lesson around the history of hip-hop and what were the components that created the culture as well as the music form. In order to ground today's learning, I have a series of questions that I want you to keep in your mind as we go through this very short lesson. The first question that we're going to be able to answer by the end is where, when, how, and why hip-hop was created. Secondly, we're going to look at who created hip-hop. Now, before we go deep into this particular question, I want to be very clear. While there's not one particular person that can be credited for the invention of such a large musical and cultural form, there are a few individuals that are highly recognized and regarded as inventors or significant contributors to the birth of the culture as well as the music. Finally, we'll be taking a look at what are the elements of hip-hop. Today, hip-hop can be found everywhere. On radio, on streaming platforms. You can YouTube pretty much anything about hip hop and learn about it or celebrate the culture and or the music. Or even in shows where the music is integrated directly into the script of a particular episode or movie. I want you all to take a look at this example, which comes from one of my favorite pieces of content currently on television. It's a cartoon called Craig of the Creek that airs on the Cartoon Network.
Maybe if we just...
Auxiliary power activated. Press start to continue. The big triangle.
Oh, thanks.
I'm here from the future. I know you don't believe me. I'm Deltron. This is Automator. We had to retreat somewhere remote where we could be alone. Continue our studies of the ancient funk flows. Didn't expect to see others in the zone. My calculator is off. I thought I was alone. Keep this creek a secret, you understand. There could be soldiers from the future tracing where I am. My mission, uncover more analog jams. The music is my muscles. Without it, it's no chance. The people in control of the future have their hand in everything, telling me not to do that. I feel that maybe this might be the place to replenish my supply before it totally evaporates.
While for the conventional viewer, we just saw a 30-second clip of 4 kids interacting, one in which was rapping and telling the story of where they're from. But in the background, what I want you to consider is that there was somebody who wrote, recorded, and synced or did voiceover to place this in the cartoon. There's the misconception that hip-hop artists are only successful if they are known in the mainstream world by millions and millions of people, and that is not the case. The person who is responsible for the writing and recording and voiceover that we just heard is a rapper named Del the Funky Homo Sapien, which you won't know due to any mainstream work, but Del the Funky Homo Sapien is considered by many a legend in the game. This video is also super important to me, not just because it's one of my favorite shows, but because it demonstrates just some of the many ways that hip-hop shows up in our day-to-day lives. But this wasn't always the case. In fact, when hip-hop first started, it was very much frowned upon, and no one ever imagined it would last as long as it's lasted, nor that it would have the impact on the world that it continues to have. Which leads us to our first question of the day. Where did hip-hop come from? I want you to take a look at this 40-second video, and I want you to really not only hear what the person is saying or the people are saying, but also look at the imagery that is showing in the video. It'll be very important to some of the discussions that we'll be having over the next couple of minutes.
Hip-hop owes its beginnings to a particular place and a particular time. The place was the South Bronx, and the time was the 1970s. The South Bronx was a notorious borough of New York City, marked by some of the worst levels of unemployment, dereliction, and violent crime in America.
You had a lot of gang activity that was happening in the Bronx back in the late 60s, early 70s. You had a lot of drugs in the communities, a lot of violence and robberies, things was going on. The Bronx was called one of the destructive areas of the time.
So now that we have a sense of where hip hop was created, what about the when and why? Let's take a look at another short clip from this same documentary that I'll tell you a little bit more about in a few.
While life in the city had become tougher, mainstream black music in the 70s had softened into the ultimate form of crossover pop: disco. The generation growing up in the Bronx in the 70s found that music like disco was wildly out of step with the reality of their lives.
It was something that seemed very far away from what ghetto kid on the street could realistically hope to attain or to be a part of. That whole idea of the flashy, the gaudy, the costume, all that stuff was something that hip-hop reacted against.
I guess we wasn't enough high society to be down with the disco, John Travolta dancing and all that. You know what I'm saying? So we created our own, you know what I'm saying? We created our own party.
Now let's take a look at a small clip that will answer the question, who created hip hop?
Hip-hop's genesis can be traced to this inconspicuous housing project on the edge of the South Bronx. It was here that hip-hop's founding father, DJ Kool Herc, built his first sound system in 1971.
1520 Cedric Avenue, the historic birthland of the culture they call hip-hop music.
Now that we've looked at this clip, I want to pause here and say to you that DJ Kool Herc is considered by many to be the father or godfather of hip hop. However, he himself will tell you that there were many other people who contributed to its origin story that I'm going to touch upon in a few. Now that we've discussed the who, what, where, why, and how, and when on a basic level, I want to get a little more granular or deeper and get into some of the macro reasons that influenced the birth of hip hop. Starting with recession as number one. If you look at New York City during the mid-20th century, around the 1950s and 60s, you start to see a lot of shaping up for the conditions that led to hip hop. A recession in particular that impacted the city for decades resulted in things such as, but not limited to, extreme poverty, extreme unemployment, which obviously would impact the poverty levels. And when you think about how things like this impact the adults in a community, think about the children. The children had limited access to recreational programs, after-school programs, places and spaces that kept them safe and allowed them to explore and experiment in new areas. For example, learning how to play musical instruments. This was not something they had access to. Number two, the Urban Renewal Act of 1949. It eliminated, quote, substandard housing to be replaced with adequate housing. However, the byproduct of this Urban Renewal Act, be it intentional or otherwise, is that it displaced a lot of people, and as a result, less houses were replaced than the ones that were destroyed. So still looking around the mid-20th century, New York City, United States at large, but we're honing into New York very specifically. The Highway Act of 1956. It was enacted to make cross-country and cross-state travel more easy. Now, when you think about being on highways, streets today, we can easily visualize the highways that we may take back and forth to get to work, school, etc. on a day-to-day basis. But in this particular instance in the South Bronx, many buildings, homes, places where people live, communities were uprooted, destroyed, and those people were displaced. And number 4, going back to that imagery that I asked you all to pay attention to in that earlier video that answered the question of where hip hop was started, we have slumlords. Slumlords were essentially landlords who back during this time period were intentionally, in many cases, hiring somebody for pennies to set their buildings on fire because they knew they'd be able to get an insurance policy from fire damage to the building. They make a killing, which is a colloquialism for a lot of money, off of the destruction of these buildings, and then they go and live their lives while hundreds, thousands of lives are impacted. And with the 3 aforementioned conditions that led to this birth of this culture, you have to begin to ask yourself, how many of these folks who were displaced by one, if not all 4 of these factors, had the means to be able to move and find a better life somewhere else? Now, I already stated it, but I'll say it again. Those are just 4 of several external factors that impacted the growth of hip-hop culture. This is, again, we're looking beyond how the music was created, the DJing, the parties, etc., etc. These are factors that cause for the ingenuity, if you will, the genius that was tapped into to ultimately build this beautiful culture that we share and celebrate. However, as we can see looking at this next slide, there's so many more people, places, and things that influence the birth and development of hip hop. Looking at the 4 names listed here, you can see pretty much all of these names, all these people in the documentary that was used in some of those earlier clips at the beginning of this lesson. I strongly encourage you, if not while in class, sometime after, to go ahead and just do a quick Google search on these names to get a sense of what roles they played in the development and the birth of hip-hop culture. Looking at the technology, this is not an expansive list of the hardware that influenced early hip-hop, but these are just some of the things that I personally feel played a known and celebrated, and in some cases not so celebrated, role in the growth and expansion of hip-hop. The ability for people to be able to access it. Looking at cassette tapes, for example, in early hip-hop days, when you went to events, they were one-of-one events. And what I mean by that is that they couldn't be duplicated. You got the experience of that moment and that time. And ultimately what started happening is, as the buzz grew, people would come with cassette tape recorders, boom boxes that had cassette tape recorders, and secretly record the DJ sets to then be able to duplicate these cassette tapes and either sell them or give them away to their friends or re-listen to them with their friends in other neighborhoods outside of the South Bronx, because they were so excited about what was happening. They didn't even have a name for hip hop at this time, but folks just knew it was something exciting and they wanted to be a part of it and they wanted to share it. And so this was something that they did, which ultimately allowed for more people to gain access to it. Looking at the musical genres, from these musical genres listed, not necessarily these alone, but certainly in the early stages of hip hop, this list of music genres represents the music that DJs played during hip-hop parties and events, and ultimately producers sampled from to make the beats that to this day we hear when we hear hip-hop music. And then looking at the cultures, the ethnic backgrounds of people who impacted the culture, the development of hip-hop, these were the folks who were prevalent in the South Bronx and in New York City, who were going to these events and contributing in their own unique ways to the growth and development. Again, I encourage you to do further research at the end of this lesson to get a better sense of all the factors that impacted the growth and development of hip-hop. We're now at that point of the lesson where we're nearing the end, and there's only 2 slides remaining. Going back to our questions of the day, our third and final question was, what are the elements of hip-hop? Now, I'm not going to go into a long spiel because it's written out pretty clearly on these slides. So I want you to read them amongst yourselves or out loud along with Professor Cooper and spend some time thinking about these elements. But before you do, I will say this one thing. There are 4 creative elements in hip hop, which you see on this slide. And when we go to our final slide, you will see the 5th element that we discuss in a little bit of detail because it's important to understand how it brings together the 4 creative elements. Now that you've had a chance to read about the 4 elements, do you notice anything about them? If you thought or answered out loud, they all represent different, very unique creative avenues, then you're right. What do I mean by this? Graffiti or aerosol art, which is technically considered to be the first element because way before hip hop music existed, people were writing on walls. You can go all the way back to ancient Egypt, ancient Mayan and Aztec culture, many ancient cultures and traditions that wrote on walls to convey messages, to keep history, to tell the stories of their people, etc., etc. But even in the more modern day, during this time when hip hop was created, tagging your name, your neighborhood, repping, as they call it, representing where you're from, was something that existed far before the other creative elements. It is what would be considered a form of visual art. No different than going to a traditional museum and seeing art on the wall. And yes, if you've never been to an exhibit in particular that demonstrates hip hop culture, then it's important that you know that they do exist all around the country and the world. And usually when these exhibits are curated, you will see some level of graffiti or aerosol art included in it. The second element, DJing, scratching, turntablism, is your musical instrument element. Now, if you choose to continue to go on your hip hop journey after this class is done, you may come across some theories of folks who might suggest that DJing is a very easy thing to do because they're taking music that's already created and reusing it to their own liking. I highly disagree. The third element, breakdancing, is a collage of many different dance forms that came from Black people, African people, West Indian, Latinx folks, and so on and so forth. Dances that were popular at that time that they took and put their own spin on it. The type of art form that breakdancing represents is within the name, dance. You think about classical dance. If you grew up in the church, you have liturgical dance, you have ballet, all sorts of types of dance. And breakdancing, the amount of strength, practice, mastery it requires is no different than any of those other genres. And finally, the element that I am most familiar with, it is the element that was the last of the 4 creative to be birthed, emceeing. That would be more like your singing. People sing songs, people recite poems. It is widely known that the art of emceeing has its roots in spoken word poetry. And so emceeing is your oral art form. So again, when you think about the 4 creative elements, you're looking at 4 different styles of art: dance, oral, music instrument, and visual art. And finally, we move on to our final element, knowledge, which again, because it's well written, in my opinion, on this slide, I'm gonna let you all take the time to read and reflect upon. Well, that's it for today's lesson. If you have interest in doing any further reading or reviewing, I have offered a bunch of resources here. If you have any questions or confusion about anything, please feel free to ask Professor Cooper and he will likely be able to answer your questions. But if not, let him know to shoot me a correspondence and I'll try to answer as best as I can, as quickly as I can. Y'all enjoy and we'll see you in the next lesson.